Okay, good morning. Today we are going to be doing Lama Gimel Lama Beis, but in order for us to get there, we still have to finish Lama Gimel Lama Aleph, and I had to get to do a couple things that we didn't actually do yet on Lama Beis, and Lama Gimel Aleph. So I just want to catch up on some things before we move on. Number one, we had the story yesterday that we mentioned about the chassid who would the chassidim Rishonim would wait sha'achas before the davening, sha'achas after the davening. They would daven for an hour, and we said a story about a chassid echad who was mispala baderech, and there was a sar who came up to him and he didn't pause for him. And he should have paused for him according to the halacha. For a guy when it's sakana, you should be pausing. So he gave him a reason why he didn't pause. This guy was so taken by the reason that he didn't end up killing him and let him go on his way. Fine. So I wanted to focus on a couple of things. Number one, the Rav Nissim Gaon over here brings down a Gemara. They bring it down as Kuf Gimel Amud, but it's actually Kuf Gimel based in Bava Kama. Gemara Bava Kama tells us in Kuf Gimel Beis that whenever the Gemara uses the term Chassid Echad, it is either Behuda ben Bava or Behuda ben Eloi, or Behuda bar Eloi. Behuda bar Eloi, look at the Gemara in Shabbos. On Lama Gimel is also known as the Rosh Hamadam B'Chol Makom because of the whole story with the Romans. When he praised the Romans, as opposed to Shem Mechai, who cursed the Romans and he had to run away, and as opposed to Rabbi Yossi, who stayed silent, who was put into exile. If every story in the Gemara is Ma'aseh B'Chassid Echad, either B'Huda and Bavel, the Gemara Sanhedrin Yadal tells us was killed with arrows because he was giving smicha to the people against the Roman will, or B'Huda bar Eloi, who's from the greatest of the Tanaim of the students of Rabbi Akiva after the 24,000 had died in Nivamis. So why doesn't, in fact, the Gemara mention that this story was either Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi or Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? This is the question that I want to try to answer. The answer, I think, could be because many times in Shas you have a story of a Chassid Echad, and maybe it's not the most complimentary. For example, we had the Gemara earlier on Yudches. You remember the Gemara over there talked about a guy who went to Beis Hakvaros or Rosh Hashanah because he got into a fight with his wife because they had given stuck and his wife got angry at him because he had no money left. That itself wouldn't be so bad. But if you remember what happened in the Beis Hakvaros was he heard the spirits talking and he realized then how to make a big parnasa. So the next year he had a huge parnasa, and he went back to the cemetery in Rosh Hashanah to hear again the spirits. And his wife and him weren't fighting then. So maybe that is not exactly the most ideal. So therefore, we don't want to mention the name of the chassid. Another example of a Gemara where we say Ma'aseh B'Chassid Echad, not necessarily the most complimentary, at least not necessarily on the face, is the Gemara tells us in Shabbos Kuf Chav Zayin Ma'aseh B'Chassid Echad, who redeemed a girl and then had her sleep by his feet. And the next morning he went to the mikvah, and the students didn't say anything to him. So he said to them, "What were you thinking?" So they said, "Oh, maybe you had made her sleep by you because you didn't trust your students." And why did I go to the mikvah? Oh, maybe because of the fact that because of the exertion of the travel, but not that he did anything wrong. He says, "Yes, the same way you judge me favorably, so too Hashem should judge you favorably." But one other Gemara, which is also in Shabbos, which relates to something that we talked about on Friday night a few weeks ago, is the Gemara tells us that in Shabbos Kuf Nun, that Ma'aseh B'Chassid Echad, who was walking around this field on Shabbos, and he saw that there was a pirza, and he's like, "Oh, I got to fix this." And he's like, "Oh, it's Shabbos, I can't fix the pirza in the fence." And so he waited, he didn't do it. Or the version of the Yerushalmi is that he intended to do it on Shabbos. Then he remembered with Shabbos, says, "I'm never going to fix the fence either way." So he ends up with a big nace. The Gemara says a big nace, and happened, and slough grew. The caper bush grew in this area. Remember the word slough. We're going to have it soon in the next parak. And he made a big parnas out of it. A nace happened. He made a big parnas out of it. What does this relate to? This relates to Martinus Kaf Daled. We talked about in this past Friday night. Whether or not you're able to do business in Maaseh. So he was misparnas from a nace. Maybe that's not so complimentary, as we said that one should not supposed to get a parnasa from a nace. So perhaps for these reasons, we hide when we say some of the stories of Ma'aseh B'Chassid Echad, because the number of them are potentially somewhat questionable. That was one. Second, The halacha we say Shechnar Harchaim Pei Gimel Tzadi Gimel. I'm sorry. We say that we bring on the Gemara that when it comes to davening, you have to wait shor achas. You have to wait shor achas before davening, shor achas after davening. So does that mean that we're like the Chassidim Rishonim? Clearly not. The Magen Avraham points out that for the Chassidim Rishonim it's literally an hour, but for the regular people it's a shor mu'etas. Not an actual hour, but a minute, something to be able to get your mind in the mindset of davening, and a minute in your mindset after davening that you're not running out of shul. But the lashon of Magen Avraham is that even though all the time when we say shah achas, we mean shah achas, over here it's only for the Hasidim or Rishonim who are going to have a shah achas, but for the regular people, that's the lashon of the Magen Avraham. The Ayin Magen Avraham. So he says the avagav the b'chol magim shah he shah mu'etas hacha he shah echad miyubei shah b'yom. Even though normally shah achas would be shah mu'etas, here it's specifically shah achas, at least for the Hasidim Harishonim. If you just go around here in Brachos, for example, when we talk about shah achas, we just had literally a Gemara. We had a Gemara before. We had a Gemara on. We had a Gemara that told us in the Mishnah, Zion. The Mishnah told us that Rabbi Gamliel wanted to say Shema on the night he was getting married. Talmidim said to him, Rabbi, aren't you say don't we learn Chutz and Patim and Kriyas Shema? Amalim, Eini Shemei Lachem Levatel Heimeni Malchus Shamayim Afilu Sha'achas. I'm not gonna listen to you guys to Mevatel for me the Shem Shemaim for Sha'achas. Means for an hour? No, obviously means for a second, right? Or we had the Gemara. The Gemara told us. The Gemara told us that there was a machlokes in the beginning of the in the fourth parak. We talked about what does it mean on Chav Zayin, right? We talked about what does it mean b'cham hashemesh v'namas, right? When did that happen? So the Gemara ended up saying that v'bay same Rabbi Yehuda hay boker yisera lahaktim lo yisha achas, right? Because remember Rabbi Yehuda holds himself that you can daven ad bad b'chlav shachas, right? The fourth hour, but he says b'cham hashemesh v'namas says lahaktim lo yisha achas to bring that back an hour earlier. So over there it would seem to mean literally. So you see sometimes shah achas could mean an actual shah. Sometimes it could be just a second. So it's not 100% clear. Maybe that is part of the reason that when we're saying that the Shulchan Aruch is bringing down that we have to wait a shah achas, he means it depending on, it's in the eye of the beholder. If you're the kind of a person that's a chassid echad, you're going to wait a shah achas. If you're the kind of person that's a regular person, your shah achas is going to be much, much shorter. The last point you just mentioned, we're going to have in a couple of days on Laman Hay. We're going to talk about the machlokes, famous machlokes between Mishmal and Shimon Chai in terms of the ability to make it work financially versus learning the whole day. Shimon Chai says a person has to learn the whole day. Shmuel says a person can work and learn. And the Gemara says that Harbe Asik Reb Shimon V'loy also be on them. It didn't work out for them. They tried, but it didn't work out for them. Harbe Asik Reb Shmuel V'loy also be on them. A lot of people worked out like Reb Shmuel. They work and they learn, and it worked out for them. So I think it's interesting because here we're talking about the Chasidim Harishanim, and the Gemara asks that Malach and Echanasis, right? When do they do the work, right? The Gemara says, Teros and how did they learn? They were so busy davening all day. Somehow, says the Gemara, Terosan Misbarachas, Malachtan, the Gemara says Terosan Mishtameres, Malachtan Misbarachas. Somehow they remembered their Torah, and their work was blessed. Whatever little bit that they did, it was able to be successful. How does that fit with this idea of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that we're saying is Harba Asik Rabbi Shimon V'loy also be Adam. It sounds like these people didn't even learn, and their Torah was still managed to be retained. So I'm not 100% clear. Just leave that as a question. That's number one I wanted to mention from yesterday on Laman Beis and Beis. On Laman Gimel Maralf, the last Gemara that we had, we said right before the two dots, about 15, 20 lines up, the Gemara said that Nekama is great because it comes within the two Shemis of Hashem, Kel Nekama Hashem, right? Kel Nekama Shefia, the Shir Shem that we had yesterday, the ones that was cute, right? So the Gemara said Kel Nekamas Hashem that Nekama is great. The Gemara says, yeah, it is great. But Milsa Mia Gedoli, during the right time, when it is for Nekama, that would be appropriate. It would be good. It would be great. And so the Gemara said, but don't we have two different Nekamas? One's Lataiva, one's Lara. And the Gemara gives an example. What is the one that's Lataiva? Afia Mehar Paran. And Lara, the Siv Kel Nekamas Hashem, Kel Nekamas Sefia. So what it sounded like is that one is good and one is bad, right? One type of nekama is a good thing, one type of nekama is a bad thing. But in fact, they're both good. Look at the Gemara there in Bava Kama Lamed Ches that we're discussing. And what does it mean? The nekama that we're talking about there is the nekama that Hashem had taken on the Goyim was, the pasuk says, Rav Ayater Goyim. He was matir because he saw that they were not keeping Shemitz B'nei. He was matir M'mayin Yisrael. So it was a good nekama. It's good for the Jews. So you have to look at there. Rashi tells us in Hen Tzadi Beis that when the Gemara is saying achas latova, achas lara, it doesn't mean achas lara of the Jews. Achas is lara of the Goyim, and achas is latova of the Yidden. They're both good for us. They're both good for us. One is, and ultimately they're both bad for the Goyim. But when we say achas lara, achas latova, it doesn't mean one is good for the Jews and one is bad for the Jews. They're both good for the Jews. And she also pointed out, because we can't ever do that Gemara in Bava Kama Lamed Ches without mentioning the famous Meiri, that the Meiri says that Gemara, and in general, all the sugyas that would seem to be discriminatory against the Akum, is referring to the various religions that are not Gidros Be'darke Hadasos, is the famous language of the Meiri, which means nations that didn't have the religion in his day of Christianity, or other sort of religions that are intelligent, they are moral, and the ones that are intelligent and moral, the discriminatory legislation against Akum simply doesn't apply to them. This is the two things that I wanted to mention that we hadn't done yesterday, and now we start New Gemara today. So it says Gemara 2 dots, about 5 lines down from the very wide lines on Lam and Gimel. Amar Le Rav Shemen Bar Abba Rav Yechanan Michdi. He says, let's understand. Anshek Nesagadela Tiknal Yisrael Brachot Tefillah exclusive of dollars. Right? The Anshek Nesagadela, when we're talking for the Jewish people, the various brachas that we say, the tefillahs that we say, the kiddush that we have, and Havdalah. Next, the Heichen Tikkun. Let's see how they were attacking these things. Says the Gemara, like in other words, why do you have to have a question about whether if you say Atzafan Antanu and you put in Havdalah, if you don't put in Havdalah, if you forget, like what? Let's just find out what the takanas were. What did the Anshek Nesagadela do? So Amarle, it's not so simple. Rabbi Yechon explains to them, it's not so simple. Why is that? Because betchila kavua betfila. Initially, when the Jewish people, had come back to Eretz Yisrael, you had the Anshek Nesagadela, they were talking that the way you are going to be Yaitza, your different chiyuvim is in davening, shiru. But when they became wealthy, meaning they were able to afford to do it on wine, so kavu alakais, they made you do the kiddush and the havdalah on an actual cup of wine. But that's not the end of the story. He'anu, they eventually, unfortunately, became poor again. So chazru v'kavu b'tfilah. Again, they said that you have to put it in the davening. That is to say, I think that this Gemara is actually a raya to the question of whether kiddush ala kais is the eraisa or not. So it's one of the interesting discussions in the Rishonim. Vilkachas to the Rashba, 7 Daled, is kiddush ala kais mida eraisa or mida rabbanan? When we do kiddush in the davening, are we yaitze kiddush or not? This comes up as a fundamental question to answer if you're able to be married to your wife in kiddush. Not the wife being married to the husband in Kiddush. Forget that. That's an interesting question in general. But is a husband able to marry to his wife in Kiddush? If a wife is compared, even though Kiddush is a mitzvah, so say she has man grumba, kol she yesh nemishimas, yesh nemisir, bezocher. Anybody who has to keep shamas and mishamas has to keep zocher and mishamas. So to a woman is b'chayit. In all mitzvahs loisa says it relates to Shabbos. The soda she has, the hekesh she also has to do. She also has to keep Kiddush. So women are mechuyev in kiddush mida araisa. So if that's the case, kol sheyesh nem Shamar Yeshnam Bezachar, and she has a chiyuv deraisa to do kiddush. So on Shabbos, she has not davened. She has not yet said the words. So how's the husband able to be yotzer if he's already yotzer kiddush and tefillah? He already said vayichulu in Shemona Esrei. He said vayichulu after Shemona Esrei. That's a whole other topic. But he's ready to yotzer kiddush. How's he able to meet his wife? So we have various answers in the Afran to explain. Either he has kavanah not to be yaitze, or he's only yaitze half of the Minchas Chinuch's line. The Chassam Sofer says he has kavanah not to be yaitze, or the Minchas Chinuch says no, he was only yaitze half of Kiddush, because Kiddush is two requirements. One, you have to remember Ma'aseh Bereshis, and two, you have to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim. But Achil only has Ma'aseh Bereshis, doesn't have Yitzias Mitzrayim. So you weren't yaitze Kiddush yet. Fine. Or the third opinion says that the women were already yaitze by accepting Shabbos when they lit candles. So they already were yaitze there. That is, in a sense, like a kiddush. So therefore, they're also chiyuv is only drabanan now. So drabanan, message drabanan. So then it's all fine. So any one of these answers could work. But what it seems to me from here is clear is that kiddush al hakais is a drabanan. Why? Because initially the takana was for kiddush to say it in tefillah. It was only later when they became rich that they decided to put it on the kais. But it wasn't as the Eraisa that Kiddush is required on a kais. It's the only situation where somebody's wealthy enough to have wine. Additionally, the point that you see here is that initially it sounds like that they would do Kiddush in davening when they were poor, and then when they became rich, they didn't do Kiddush in davening, they only did Kiddush on the kais. We're doing it now on both. But initially, it sounds like they would move it. It was interchangeable. Here's the Gemara. When they said Hamavdil b'tfilah tzarich sheyavdil akay. So they said that somebody who is making Havdalah says after Charantanu and Shemona Esrei, nevertheless still has to be mavdil on the kais. So therefore, that's the question of what the takana was. Again, it's complicated. There was a story, Shalshalas Hadvarim, depending on how wealthy they were, and we concluding that ultimately a person who makes Havdalah in Shemona Esrei still has to be mavdil on the kais, provided that he has sufficient resources to have wine. In my name of Chebar Abba, similar, we're going to say, Amar Rabbi Yechon, Anshin Nesagdil, Tilam Yisho Barafs at Tfilas Lucius Havdalah. It's the same exact line that we just had. B'Tchila Kavu B'Tfila. Right, initially they put it into the davening. Shiru, when they became wealthy, Kavu Ala Kais. Then they changed the takana, and then they said you should do it on the kais. Chazivanu, they became poor again, so Kavu B'Tfila again, they put it back in the davening. V'Heim Amar, and they said, ultimately, Hamavdil B'Tfila, somebody who says Havdalah in Tfila, great, but still, they still have to say Havdalah on the kais. So ultimately, instead of having it just one or the other, it becomes effectively the way we have it today, which is both, right? That we also are doing Havdalah and Kiddush, both in Tefillah and on a kais. Good? Here's the Gemara. Idmar Nami. We additionally have another line on this point from Rabbi Yosef, the Amri Tarvayu. So Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef say it together, right? We just had back on, where was it, on Chavtes Amud Beis. Chavtes Amud Beis, we also had a situation of Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef, the Amri Tarvayu. And as I mentioned, actually I didn't mention here because I did those on recording in my room. This is a very fascinating thing to have Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef do things, saying things together. That's the Gemara Harish Yudalid, that Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef, they had asked the question, should become a Shiva, and then more than Harish tells us that the Rabbi Yosef should be the Shiva because he is a Sinai, and this is the days before Google. So somebody who knows everything is more valuable than somebody who is an Iker Harim, somebody who's very deep. Rabbi was very deep. So they said the Rabbi Yosef should be the Rosh Shiva. Rabbi Yosef refused to be Rosh Shiva Samach Rabba. And we know the end of Rabba and the whole Gemara about Mitzvah, how he passed away. But the Gemara says an amazing thing about Rabbi Yosef. During the 22 years that Rabba was Malach, Rabbi Yosef wouldn't even let a blood letter come to his house and treat him like with honor because he wasn't a Shiva. It was all Rabba. And they nevertheless they got along very well. So Rabbi Yosef Amrit Havayu Hamavdil B'Tfilah Tzar Sheyav L'Lakais. Exactly what we just said. Like the Anshin said, ultimately, even though you are saying Tachanatanu, you still have to do Havdalah on the kais. Again, provided somebody is sufficiently wealthy, this Gezerah applies, and we do, as we do today, we do both. Amar Rava. So Rava says, I can ask a question on the Shemaitza that we heard. What is that? Ta'ah v'lo his gvuras k'shomitz kas. Imagine somebody forgot. He made a mistake and didn't say Mashav Arach, Moshe Elber Shanim, and somebody forgot to say Saint Talamatar. Machzirin, I say again, we've discussed yesterday already, or now it's 2 days ago when we discussed the idea of going back. What does Machzirin I say mean? Does it mean going? Does Machzirin I say mean that one has to go back to Shemini Tefillah, go back to the beginning of Shemini Esrei, being able to be yet in a situation where it's the tircha, either because, like the Rebbeinu Chanan said, because they're going to be waiting for you, or because of the fact that you're able to be yaitze, because you could focus on the Shliach Tzibor, you're davening with the Tzibor, all these various possibilities where maybe you don't have to go back. Again, we're not getting into that now. Nevertheless, this brisa is clear that for Mashiv Aruach or B'Sein Talamat Levrav, if you forgot, you have to be Machzir. Abdullah B'Chanin Adas, a Machzir, nice. But when somebody forgets Atachan Antoni, he doesn't have to go back. Why? So what does that mean? I thought we just said that ultimately Takan Achignes Agdela was Sarach. Right? It sounded like the Lashon was Sarach Shiavdala Kais. Provided that there was sufficient wealth, you have to go back and say it again on the case. It's not like an option. So why are we saying over here that Abdul B'Chanan Adas, you're not master the guy because he's able to say it on the case? It sounds like if he did, it sounds like he has a choice. Like if he did say Atachan Antanu, then he wouldn't have to. He has the option to say it on the case. Says more, don't say that when we're saying that it's like giving him optionality. No, that's not what it means. Say rather what it means is that he does say it on the case. He does say it on the case. Fine. So let's change it up and make that fit with the previous line that we had, where again the takana was that you do say it on the case, even though you said it during davening. Marnami is similar. Amr Rabbi Yomi Bar Yefes. This is, I think, our first time having him in brachas, but it is a very fascinating topic of giving names about people who are not Jewish. Right? Yefes, Yefes is the son of Noach. We don't have anything against him per se. That Gemara coming up now to Adar. So the Gemara Megillah Tess. We have a lot to say about Yefes. That's very nice. Yefes, right? What is the Yafus? So Yefes, right, is the Torah is kosher in Greek, according to Shimon Gamliel. So it's not negative that the name is Yefes, but it is interesting that he had a name that would be clearly a non-Jewish name. And does this fit with the Gemara in Yud Aleph about the names of the people, of the Jewish people outside of Eretz Yisrael? The Gemara says were Shemus Kechol HaGoyim. They had non-Jewish names. Not 100% clear if that fits within that or not. Okay, continues the Gemara. So Rabbi Yomi Yefes Shal Rabbi Yosi asked Rabbi Yochanan B'Tzidain. So Rabbi Yomi Yefes said that they asked Rabbi Yochanan in Tzidain. Tzidain is one place in Lebanon. V'Amrila Rabbi Shimon ben Yaakov D'min Tzor. The other said Rabbi Shimon ben Yaakov from Tzor, which is another city in Lebanon. That's Rabbi Yochanan. So they either way, whichever version it is, they ask Rabbi Yochanan the following question: if somebody already said Atachan Antanu in the davening, does he have to make Havdalah on a kais or not? He has to, right? As we have already pointed out, that is the takana, one has to do so. So the Gemara asks, okay, you have to make Havdalah on the kais. Do you have to make Havdalah during the davening? From the davening. That was the Iker Takana. Right? When they came to Eretz Yisrael, they were poor. The Iker Takana, when the Anshe Knesset started off saying you have to make Havdalah, they said it only in Tefillah. There was no question. There was no kais. There was no money. There was no wine. The Iker Takana was Tefillah. So Amri Amavda, so Gemara says, "Kavachar Matzil Matzil Dikat Takanti." Amri Amavda Matzil Shosh Yavdal Kais. Then we say that somebody who's Mavdal and Tefillah has to be Mavdal on the Kais. So Mavdal Kais La'ad Iker Takanti, like goes against it. Somebody who's Mavdal on the Kais, which is not the Iker Takana. So that isn't. Don't you say it's a kol shkein that he's going to have to be Mavdal in the Shemana Esrei? Like I don't understand the question. Says the Gemara. So this is very interesting. Acha Aricha must have been very tall. Who else do we know is very tall? Abba Aricha, who is the Nam de Gur of Rab. Right? Rav's other name was Av Aricha, very tall people. Okay, very tall nose is different from very tall today. Nevertheless, they were considered very tall. Right? Shaul was Meshichmer Lamala Gavay Mikalam. He was very tall. So Rabbi Aricha said as follows: Tani Rabbi Acha Aricha Kamei de Rav Chinana Hamavdil B'Tfila Meshubach Yersem Mishayavdil Akais. He taught in front of him the following idea that somebody who's Mavdil Ichman Esher, somebody who says Atachanantano, is more praiseworthy from somebody who's Mavdil Alakais. Vim hivdil bazu yenuchle brachas al Rosh. And if he is mavdil in the kais and in Shemana Esrei, he's going to get tremendous amount of blessing. Says more, I don't understand what you're talking about. Hag gufa kasha. What are you saying? Ham amris ham mavdil b'tfila mishubach yosem mishayavdil kais. On the one hand, you said that somebody who's mavdil in the Shemana Esrei is mishubach more than somebody who's mavdil in the kais. What does that tell me? Alma tefila lechudei sagi. That tells me, should seemingly tell me, that somebody who's mavdil on in Shemana Esrei, that's sufficient. The harder Tani and on the other hand, you say to me that somebody who's mavdil in both, he gets huge amounts of brachas. If there, and so if that's the case, then it sounds like if somebody was just simply doing one, he's parted from doing the other one. If that's the case, that one is sufficient. So v'havi bracha she'enet tzricha. Isn't that going to now be a bracha she'enet tzricha? V'amra b'tem reish lagish, amar l'rechem reish lagish damar tavayu. Either way, kol mavarch bracha she'enet tzricha. Everyone shem l'sisa. That you shouldn't make bracha she'enet tzricha. It's a bad thing to do so. So the question that we're asking is, ultimately, if making Havdalah in the Shemana Esrei is the Iker Takana, but they were also requiring you to do it in the Kais, if it's not really needed, if it's not really necessary, then don't you run into the problem of Bracha She'enet Tzricha, which we say is potentially violating a lot of Leisisa. And in fact, while it is the Machlekes Achronim, the general understanding of Safek Brachas Lahakel, according to most Achronim, is Savik brachas lahakel means not to make the bracha. Right? If you're not sure, then don't make it. So over here, what's the question? We know that you're already yaitz if you say atachanatano alone. So yeah, you were saying that you have to make it on the kais. Why? Why is it necessary to do both? If we have just the kais, whatever the ikatakana is, whichever one you want, but why do you have to do both? Says the Gemara, you have to explain it like this. If you just did one, you get brachas. That's obviously sufficient. You're already yaitza. But fundamentally, the takana wasn't, the takana is, and we don't view it as a problem brachas and tzricha to do it on both. Again, with regards to kiddush, that we say kiddush and tefillah, and we say kiddush alakais. You don't even get to the question of brachas and tzricha. Why? Because there are going to be people who weren't yet say kiddush. Right? Even if you already were yet say partial kiddush, or even whole kiddush, depending on whatever opinion it is. But if you're going to a meal with these other people, so it's not a bracha and a tzricha, you're being like the others. So that's not a question. The only question would be if you're having a meal alone and you already damish from Esther, you already said, or at least Baychulu, is according to those that say that you're already were yet say kiddush, then is it a question of bracha and tzricha? No, because the takana is by definition, something that makes it not a bracha she'enet tzricha. You can ask, well, what's the reason for the takana? We can discuss that. But clearly from this Gemara, they decided that once the people were sufficiently wealthy, but they had already put it into the Shemana Esrei to continue on with both, and we don't have the problem with bracha she'enet tzricha because that was part of the takana. By definition, a bracha she'enet tzricha is a situation where you're doing it on your own. A situation where Chazal were ready to attack it, you don't come into this problem. Okay, continues the Gemara. What happens if somebody made a mistake and didn't say the Havdalah, not in Takhanantanu, and not in the Kais? So what should he do? So the halacha is so somebody who has forgotten should go back to both. As Rashi explains, should go back to the tefillah and the kais. Meaning, he could say Shemana Esrei and he could say the Havdalah. Amalei Ravina LaRava Hilchas Samai. So return the page on Lama Gimel Beis. What is the actual practical halacha after all this? So Amalei Rava says to Ravina that practical halacha is ki kiddush. Ma kiddush af agav the mekadosh b'tzlus the mekadosh akasa. just like by Kiddush, when you are saying Vaychulu in Shemona Esrei, it's not sufficient. You still have to make Kaddish on a kais. Af Havdalah Nami, Af Gavdal Ma'avdal B'Tzlusa, Ma'avdal B'Kasa. So too by Havdalah as well, just because you Ma'avdal in the Shemona Esrei, you said at the Chanantanu, you still have to Ma'avdal on the kais. Just to point out, Rabbeinu Chananel here has an interesting line, which is not the way we paskin. Rabbeinu Chananel says, what happens in Mohiv the Motzei Shabbos? Ma'avdal v'afilu b'chamishi b'Shabbos. Says you can make Havdal even on Thursday. While he does it, say that you can't say Mari Mari H. You can only say that Miyad Motzei Shabbos and you don't have the ability to attack on that, but you could say Havdal all the way, even on Thursday. I think, as we said, we pass on the person can say until the middle of the week, but he says until even on Thursday. Okay, finish the Gemara. So now we are discussing the last part of the Mishnah, which we said that Rebbe Lezer had a different opinion. If you remember, Rebbe Lezer's opinion was that Rebbe Lezer, what do you say? You don't say Atachanatano in Atachainen. You say Atachanatano in the bracha of Haida. Rabbi Akiva said you have a special bracha, and Rebbe Lezer said you said it in Maidim. So the Gemara explains. Rab Zera have a rachiv chamra. Rab Zera was riding a donkey. Have a kashak of Azra Rab Chibar Oven Master. Chibar Oven was riding behind him. I'm not sure if Rab Chibar Oven is related. Right, we had before. Right, we had before on Chavtas and Beis the two poor brothers. Right, we had the two poor brothers of Abaye Bar Oven and Chanina Bar Oven. Chanina Bar Oven. Right, so this is Rab Chibar Oven. So he said. What did Chibar Oven? He was riding behind Rab Zera on the donkey. He says, is the halacha that they said over the name of Rabbi Yechanan that the halacha is like Rabbi Lezer on a yontif that fell out after Shabbos? In other words, on Motzei Shabbos, what do we do on Motzei Shabbos that falls out? That's a yontif that falls out after Shabbos. How do we say at the Chanantanu? In Kiddush, what do we do in Shemona Esrei? Vataydienu, right? This is the Vataydienu Gemara. But before we get to Vataydienu, so we have to go through this Gemara, and the Gemara is saying that they asked. So Reb Chibar Oven asked Reb Zera and says, "Is it true what they said over the name of Rabbi Yechon that on a yontif shechal yis acher Shabbos? In other words, that Motzei Shabbos you have to make havdalah, right? We do yak nahaz, right? By Kiddush, we do yak nahaz, and Kiddush havdalah, right? Etc. That's what we're doing. But we're not here talking about the kais. We're talking here about the Shemona Esrei. So what do you do about the Shemona Esrei? So is the halacha like Rabbi Yechon says that on Yontif Shechal Dias Achar Shabbos that you have to say Atachanatanu like Rabbi Lezer? In other words, that you put it into Haida. Why? What's the issue? Because on the Yontif Shechal Dias Achar Shabbos you don't have Atachanin, right? So if you don't have Atachanin, where are you going to put it? We're going to put Atachanatan. So maybe then we pass like Rabbi Lezer. That's what he asked him. So Amalei and Rabbi Zera says yes. The halacha of Yontif Shechal Dias Shabbos is like Rabbi Lezer. So he says back to him halacha machal de pligi. The Gemara says that it's mashma from the way the Rabbi Chibar Oven asked him the question. He says halacha ki Rabbi Lezer, right? And he says and that's the halacha was like him. So he says halacha, says the Gemara now machal de pligi. It sounds like maybe somebody argues. You don't think they argue about pligi Rabbanan? The Rabbanan argue. The Rabbanan say no. So Amud the pligi Rabbanan and Rabbanan who said they say not to and says how do you know they argue with Rebbe Lezer on the other Shechali Yisachar Shabbos? Maybe they would agree with him. Amud the pligi Rabbanan b'shari Moisas Shana. Maybe the Rabbanan disagree on shari Moisas Shana. In other words, on a regular Motzei Shabbos, they disagree with Rebbe Lezer. Rebbe Lezer says you say it in Haidan. They say no, you say it not to Chaynein. But beyond Shechali Yisachar Shabbos, me pligi. How do you know that they argue with him even on the Yontif Shechali Yisachar Shabbos? Maybe there they would agree with Rebbe Lezer. Since you know Matachin, you have to do it during Haidah. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva argues. Rabbi Akiva says that's a separate bracha. Says the Gemara, well, how's that relevant? Do we do like Rabbi Akiva at any time of the year? Rabbi Akiva holds you make a separate bracha of Atachanatan, right? Like the same like you have like the Chazan does, right, on a fast day, right? So the Chazan says Anenu as a separate bracha, right? So Rabbi Kiva holds that Atachanatan is a separate bracha. Do we ever pass on Rabbi Kiva at any point? Who cares if Rabbi Kiva disagrees? We never go with Rabbi Akiva. So our issue is only with the Rabbanan, not a question of Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva is not relevant because we know no one passing like him at any point. Does the Gemara call? Hashem kula my time I didn't Rabbi Akiva. The time is very tikkun the shesrei loy tikkun. Why don't we do like Rabbi Akiva the whole year? Because we have 18 brachas and not 19 brachas. Meaning, of course, we have 19 because of the bracha of the But let's just assume, for our purposes, now we have 18 brachas, and so Rabbi Akiva is making a 19th bracha. So no, we don't have a 19th bracha. So hakanami. So to on Yontif, shev tikkun. In other words, we have 7 brachas on Yontif and Shabbos. How many loy tikkun? We're being attacking an 8th bracha. So then we're not going with Rabbi Akiva. So in this situation, we're asking essentially on the Gemara is asking on what Reb Chiya bar Oven asked Reb Zera, that this that we say from Rabbi Yechon, this is a halacha. Halacha is mashma. There are others that argue. If there are others that argue, what are they going to say? Is Rabbanan disagreeing? In other words, Rabbi Yechon is saying that we're going with Rabbi Lezer. If it is that the halacha? Is there disagreement about this? So the Gemara concludes, and the Gemara says, Amarle lav halacha itmar. Ela matan itmar. It's not that he said it's a halacha, rather it's an inclined. It's inclined after what the position is of Rabbi Lezer. So here we have another example of Mishum Rabbeinu. I discussed this before, if you remember. We discussed Mishum Rabbeinu as Mishum Rav, right? Rabbeinu is often referred to as Rav. And over here, if you look, I don't think Rashi says anything. And again, we explained that Rashi doesn't have to say anything because of the fact that Rashi already explained before that Rabbeinu was Rav. Look at Laman on the base that we already have explained who Rabbeinu was. If you look at Rashi, Laman on the base, Rashi over there says Mishum Rabbeinu is Rav. So he didn't have to explain here. Why Rashi sometimes explains Mishum Rabbeinu is Rav and not, we have to explain because you'll see a few times in Brachot that he does explain why he chooses certain places, why he doesn't. Again, we discussed that last time. I'm not going to get into that again now. So it says the Gemara. The Imar Rabbi Tzabarav Dimi Amar Mishum Rabbeinu halacha. The Amri la matin, that they want to say the name of Rav, that it's a halacha that we are going with Rabbi Lezer, and others said to him, no, it's matin, it's just inclined like Rabbi Lezer, it's not halacha like him. Rabbi Yechon Amar Maidim, Rabbi Chiya bar Abba Amar Nirin. Rabbi Yechon says that were maided to him. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says it was Nirin like him. Amar Rabbi Zera then responds, Nakit the Rabbi Chiya bar Abba b'yadcha, take what Rabbi Chiya bar Abba said in your hands, the dayek the Gomar Shmaitim Purim Demara Shaper Kirach with the Pumpadisa. Whatever Rabbi Chiya bar Abba said, hold that in your hands dearly, because he was very much medayik and he learned the Shmaitzas from Rachba and Pumpadisa. He learned it very really well, and therefore, since he learned it so well, we can be reliant on his tradition. Right? Remember, we just had the Gemara. Right? Where did we have the Gemara? We had the Gemara. Was it on Chavches? Yeah, Chavches Amud Aleph. We had the Gemara. We remember with Rabbi Zera heard over halacha Mishmei Rabbi Yechon, and he wasn't sure. Maybe it was Rabbi Shua Levi. He learned it over 40 times. 40 times the Gemara said that when he was Cholish Migirsa, he learned it over 40 times to go over. And the Gemara said, "Chad hilach, chad hilach." Is it new to you or is it dear to you? And he says, "Oh, I thought it was Rabbi Shua Levi, so therefore now I know it's Rabbi Yechon. It was very important to him." Okay, so the Rabbi Zera is concluding over here and telling us that what we are saying in terms of Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says Nirin. So it's very interesting, right? Because initially Rabbi Zera had said that it was a halacha. Now he's saying that Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says it's Nirin, so we have to go with that. It's Nirin. Why? Because it's very much Gomer Shmaitzim and Puma Demar from Racham, like Racham Pumpadisa was very much also very precise in his traditions. Says the Gemara, the Amar Rachba, what did Rachba say? Rabbi Yehuda, Harabai stav kafulaya, or stav lefnim mistav. The Harabais was essentially like a portico within a portico, but he used a very weird word, as Rashi points out. He should have used the word itztaba to talk about a portico, not a stav. But he used the traditions the way he heard them. There's a very fascinating Rashi here. We'll focus on it more tomorrow. I just want to finish over here to finish the two dots. So I just want to continue the Gemara as we conclude with the way we have it today. Amar Rabbi Yosef, after all these opinions as to whether or not we go with Rabbi Lezer, we don't go with Rabbi Lezer, is it Lezer machlokes? Is it just inclined to him? Would they might it to him? All the different variations that we just saw. How does the Gemara end up concluding? Amar Rabbi Yosef, I have no idea if it's like this. I have no idea if it's like that. He's like, I have no idea. However, this is what I do know. Right? And we should also, So he says, I don't know. This is what I know from Rav and Shmuel. the Kidula Marganisa Bavel, that they were attacking something really precious in Bavel. But Pediano Hashem Lakinas Mishpat Kafka, something else, or Senach, Tantan, Zman is also Machag in Dava, Tashin Shavs, Murder, Hagias of Ragam, Shavs, Shamta Vidalta, Simashim, Shesma Masik Dash, 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 Sam Kishav, Lanu. So you see that essentially what we get is the whole Vatadienu comes in as a result of not knowing what do you do on Motzei Shabbat, which is a Yantif. We end up not doing like Rabbi Lezer and making a separate bracha, even though that'll be the one time that maybe you should do like him. We end up putting it in to the regular Ma'apesh bracha, the seventh bracha that we have on Yantif, because the three first, the three after, all the same. The middle bracha we put in Mataydian, which is a version of Atachan Antanu, and of course, just like we do by Shabbos, we also say that you have to Ma'avdal Kais even on Yantif. Have a wonderful